300 days married. And the most feared man in the city had never once held her hand when no one was watching. To the world, Wang Xianghwa and his wife Becky were a portrait of controlled devotion. At every gala, every private dinner, every room that mattered, he arrived with her, his hand steady at the small of her back, his presence wrapping around her like a claim. Cameras caught it all. The internet called it power, called it love. They were half right. Behind those closed penthouse doors, 40 floors above a city that obeyed him, Wang Xianghwa was a husband in name and in photographs and in nothing else. His side of the bed every morning, undisturbed. His voice in the apartment, formal, measured. The language of a man who had decided, somewhere before the wedding and long after it, that closeness was a luxury he could not afford. Becky knew the choreography by heart. She had learned the exact weight of his silence, the precise distance he kept in every private room. She wore her calm like armor and her red blouse like a quiet refusal to disappear. 300 days, and she was still there. The question no one thought to ask was, why was he? If that pulled you in, you already know where this is going. Stay with me, like and subscribe. Becky had a routine, not the kind built from joy or habit or the easy rhythm of a shared life, but the kind a person constructs deliberately, brick by brick, when the alternative is standing still long enough to feel everything. She woke before him, always, not because she had to, but because those early morning minutes belonged entirely to her, the apartment quiet, the city below still wrapped in gray light, the marble floors cool beneath her feet as she moved through a kitchen that was fully stocked and rarely cooked in. She made her coffee the way she had always made it. Strong, no sugar. Stood at the window with the mug warm between her palms and watched the city begin to wake. And for a few minutes, she was simply a woman in a high room, undisturbed. Then the day began, and with it the performance. The red blouse was not an accident. She had bought it 8 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon when she had walked through a boutique alone because she had nowhere specific to be and the alternative was returning to the penthouse early. The color had startled her, bold and unhurried and entirely hers. She had worn it to 3 events since then, and every time, something in the wearing of it felt like a small, private insistence. I am still here. I am still this. She had learned his silences the way you learn a new city, not all at once, but by moving through them until the geography became familiar. There was the silence after an event when they rode the elevator up together, and he loosened his cufflinks and looked at the floor numbers instead of her. There was the silence at the kitchen island on weekend mornings when he read reports, and she read nothing in particular, both of them present, neither of them anywhere near each other. There was the silence she had stopped trying to fill somewhere around day 140, when she understood that filling it had never once worked. She was not broken. That was the thing no one would have guessed, watching her. She smiled at the right moments and wore the right things and stood at his side with a composure that read, to anyone looking, as contentment. Women complimented her at events. Men deferred to her as an extension of his authority. She moved through those rooms like someone who belonged in them, because she had decided early that she would not move through them like someone who didn't. But composure is not the same thing as peace. And performing a life, even flawlessly, leaves a particular kind of exhaustion that sleep does not touch. At night she lay in a bed built for 2 and listened to the apartment settle around her. His room was down the hall. She had stopped counting which nights his light stayed on past midnight, because counting things that did not change served no purpose. 300 days. The number sat in her chest like a stone she had stopped trying to lift. She was still here, still standing, still wearing the red blouse when the occasion called for it. But quietly, in the space between one morning and the next, she had begun to wonder how much longer grace alone would be enough. Wang Xianghwa did not think of himself as a man who felt things. He thought of himself as a man who managed them. There was a difference, and the difference had kept him alive. He had built his empire the way certain men build walls, not carelessly, not in anger, but with intention and patience and a clear understanding that everything left exposed eventually gets used against you. Every alliance in his world had a price. Every show of softness had a consequence. He had learned this young, in rooms that did not forgive mistakes, from men who demonstrated the lesson in ways that left no room for misunderstanding. And so he had become someone who did not make mistakes, someone precise, controlled, someone the city feared quietly and respected loudly, which was exactly the arrangement he had designed. The world saw a man who walked into rooms and changed their temperature, who spoke rarely and was heard completely, who wore his authority the way other men wore cologne, not applied, but emanating. At every event, every closed-door meeting, every carefully managed public appearance, Wang Xianghwa presented the same version of himself, composed, dangerous, and entirely unmoved. He was very good at it. He had been doing it for so long that most days it did not feel like a performance at all. But the penthouse at 2 a.m. had a way of making honesty unavoidable. He stood at his window most nights long after the apartment had gone quiet. The city spread out below him in grids of light, thousands of lives compressing into something orderly from this height, something he could look at without it looking back. He had always found that easier. The view, the distance, the clean remove of 40 floors between himself and everything that moved and needed and made demands. He told himself he stood there because he was thinking about business, about the quarter's numbers, about the 3 rivals currently circling the edges of what he had built. And those things were true, they were always present, always turning in the back of his mind like machinery that never fully stopped. But there was something else on the quieter nights, something he did not name. He was aware of her, had always been aware of her, the particular quality of her stillness in a room, the way she held herself with a self-possession that owed nothing to him and never had. He had noticed it the first time he saw her, had noticed it every time since, at every event, in every elevator ride that ended in silence he did not know how to break. She did not flinch around him, did not perform nervousness, did not shrink. Most people in her position would have, and the fact that she didn't was something he found himself returning to more often than he could justify. He had chosen distance because distance was the only language he fully trusted. Closeness was a variable. Closeness was something rivals could calculate and exploit and use to dismantle everything in a single, well-aimed strike. But standing at the window in the quiet of a city he controlled completely, Wang Xianghwa was not always certain who, exactly, the distance was protecting. Day 300 arrived the way all the others had, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without the small, ordinary markers that might have made it feel like something worth nodding, a word over breakfast, a hand held in a hallway, any of the quiet gestures that accumulate in other marriages into a life. Becky noticed the date the way you notice a bruise you have stopped being surprised by. She looked at her phone that morning, saw the number, and then set it face down on the kitchen counter and finished her coffee. There was an event that evening. There was always an event. She wore the red blouse. She did her hair with care and stood in front of the mirror long enough to confirm that nothing on her face would betray what was happening underneath it. Then she walked out of the bedroom and found him in the foyer, already dressed, dark shirt, jacket, the particular stillness about him that preceded these occasions. He looked at her once, briefly, the way a man checks that everything is in order, and then he opened the door. The car, the entrance, the flashbulbs catching them mid-stride, his hand moving to the small of her back with the practiced ease of something done 100 times before. She matched her pace to his, smiled at the right faces, accepted a glass of champagne she barely touched, stood at his side while men spoke to him about things she was not expected to weigh in on, and she did not weigh in. But she listened, and she understood more than any of them realized. At some point in the evening, in the brief pause between one conversation ending and another beginning, she turned to say something to him, something small and unremarkable, a comment about the room, the kind of ordinary exchange that costs nothing. He turned at the same moment, and for just a second they were simply looking at each other, not performing, not managing, just 2 people in close proximity, the noise of the room falling briefly away. She saw something move through his expression. She could not have named it precisely. It was there for less than a heartbeat. Then he looked away, back toward the room, back toward whatever came next on the evening's unspoken agenda. She turned away too. They did not speak on the drive home. That night, Becky did not stand at the window. She had stood at enough windows. She sat on the edge of the bed instead, still dressed, the city humming its indifferent hum 40 floors below, and she looked at the floor and let the quiet settle completely around her. 300 days. She had been patient because patience felt like dignity. She had been steady because falling apart solved nothing. She had worn the red blouse and held her composure and given this marriage every reasonable thing she had. And somewhere down the hall, behind a closed door, was a man who had looked at her tonight, really looked, and chosen again to turn away. She did not cry. She simply asked the empty room the question that had been building for months, the one she had kept swallowing back down. How much longer? The room did not answer. It never did. The photography exhibit was her idea, which was itself unusual. Becky did not typically generate ideas about how to spend her evenings. She moved through most of them the way she moved through the penthouse, carefully, quietly, occupying the space without disturbing it. But she had seen the listing in a community newsletter that arrived in her inbox by some forgotten subscription. A small exhibition of documentary photography in a converted warehouse space on the east side of the city, and something in her had simply decided. She went alone, did not mention it, dressed in her own time, took a car without a scheduled return, and walked into a room full of strangers and large black and white photographs, and the low hum of people talking about something that had nothing to do with power or strategy or the careful maintenance of appearances. She felt her shoulders drop the moment she stepped inside. The photographs were extraordinary, portraits mostly, faces caught in unguarded moments, the kind of images that made you feel you were witnessing something real by accident. She moved through the room slowly, unhurried for the first time in longer than she could remember, and she let herself look. Actually look, without an agenda waiting on the other side of the moment. She had been standing in front of one photograph for several minutes, a woman laughing at something just outside the frame, her whole face committed to it, nothing held back, when a voice came from beside her. That one stopped me too. She turned. The man standing next to her was Korean, roughly her age, dressed simply in a gray jacket and dark trousers. He was looking at the photograph, not at her, with the easy attention of someone genuinely interested in what he was seeing. "It's the hands," he said. "She's reaching for whoever made her laugh. Most people forget their hands when they're happy. She didn't." Becky looked back at the photograph. He was right. She hadn't noticed the hands. "Ren Yeo," he said, extending his. "I took it, actually, so I'm possibly the least objective person in the room to be talking about it." She laughed. Not the measured, event-appropriate smile she had perfected over 300 days, but an actual laugh, short and surprised and entirely unplanned, the kind that comes up before you can decide whether to allow it. "Becky," she said, shaking his hand. He asked her which photograph had drawn her in first. She told him. He listened the way people rarely listen, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. They moved through 3 more photographs together, unhurried, trading observations that went nowhere in particular and didn't need to. He had no idea who she was married to. She could tell immediately. He was not calculating anything. He was simply there, present, interested in what she thought. It had been so long since anyone had simply been interested in what she thought. She was smiling openly, without architecture, when she felt it. A shift in the room's atmosphere, subtle the way a change in pressure is subtle. She did not look around immediately. Across the room, near the far wall, Wang Xiang stood with 2 men she did not recognize. His expression was unreadable, as it always was. But something in his jaw had tightened, and his eyes had not moved from her face. Wang told himself it was a security matter. That was the language he used when he instructed his lieutenant to expand the detail on Becky's movements. Not surveillance, not monitoring, but a security review. Standard procedure. The kind of precaution that required no further explanation in his world, because in his world, precaution was simply how things were done. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked at him with anything other than the usual brisk compliance. He was grateful for that. The first report came back within 24 hours. Detailed, itemized, the way all his information arrived. Becky's Tuesday had been straightforward: the dry cleaner, a bookshop on the west side, lunch alone at a small restaurant she had been to twice before. Nothing of note, nothing requiring attention. He read it twice anyway. The second report covered the following Thursday. She had returned to the photography exhibit space for what appeared to be a second showing, a different collection. She had been there for just under 2 hours. She had arrived alone and left alone. Midway through the visit, she had crossed paths with the same man from before, the photographer, Ren Yeo, apparently by coincidence, the kind that happens naturally in small rooms full of shared interests. They had sat together at a low table near the back with 2 cups of coffee. The report noted the duration, 41 minutes. It noted that the conversation appeared casual throughout. It noted no physical contact of any kind. Wang read that one 3 times. The third encounter appeared in the following week's report without Wang having to ask for it. His lieutenant had understood by now what was being tracked. A brief exchange outside a bookshop, apparently unplanned. Ren had been coming out as Becky was going in. They had stopped on the pavement for perhaps 15 minutes, the report said. She had been carrying a small paper bag from the shop next door. She had laughed at something he said. There was a photograph attached, taken from a distance. Surveillance quality, grainy at the edges, but clear enough. Becky stood in the mild afternoon light in a pale coat he didn't recognize, her face turned slightly upward in that laugh, open, unguarded, every part of her present in the moment in a way that hit Wang somewhere below the level of rational thought. He closed the file, opened it again, looked at the photograph for a long time. There was nothing in these reports that constituted a threat. He understood that. Ren Yeo was a documentary photographer with no criminal associations, no political entanglements, no known connections to any of the networks Wang had reason to watch. Becky's movements were innocent. The encounters were casual. The coffee had lasted 41 minutes and ended with them walking in separate directions. He knew all of this. And yet he watched every piece of footage his team had captured, in sequence, and then he watched it again. Not searching for something incriminating, not running calculations about exposure or risk. Watching the way her face changed in those moments, the ease of it, the absence of the careful composure she wore everywhere else. The thing he could not name pressed against the inside of his chest and said nothing useful at all. It was not Ren Yeo who changed everything. It was the other man. He appeared in the background of the third surveillance photograph, the one taken outside the bookshop. Wang had noticed him in passing the first time he reviewed the image, registered him as pedestrian detail, and moved on. But something drew him back to that corner of the frame on a second look. The man was not passing. He was positioned. Suited, composed, his attention arranged in a way that looked casual only if you had never spent a career distinguishing between people who happened to be somewhere and people who were there on purpose. Wang pulled the image and sent it to his lieutenant without comment. The trace took 18 hours. When the report came back, Wang read it standing up, and then he sat down, and then he read it again. The man's name was Park Sung-yi. He was not affiliated with any rival network. He carried no criminal associations, no intelligence connections, no relationship to any of the organizations Wang had reason to monitor. He was, by profession and by every record available, a family lawyer. Discreet, established, with a practice that specialized in private matters for high-net-worth clients who required absolute confidentiality. He had been retained 4 months ago. By Wang's mother. Wang set the report down on his desk. The room was very quiet. His lieutenant had included everything: the billing records, the meeting logs, a careful reconstruction of the timeline. Park Sung-yi had met with Becky on 4 separate occasions over the past 3 months. Each meeting had been brief. Each had taken place in neutral, unremarkable locations: a hotel lobby, a quiet cafe, once in the reading room of a private member's library. Nothing clandestine. Nothing that looked, from the outside, like anything other than 2 people with paperwork to discuss. Except there had been no paperwork. Not yet. The exit arrangement Wang's mother had quietly constructed had never been formally initiated, because Becky had never once moved to initiate it. His lieutenant, thorough as always, had gone further, had spoken, carefully and without revealing the nature of the inquiry, to someone in Park's orbit who knew the shape of the case without knowing its details. What emerged from that conversation reordered everything. Becky had not sought out the lawyer. The lawyer had sought out her, bearing a discreet message from a woman who believed her son was incapable of giving a wife what a wife deserved, and who had arranged, out of something she understood as compassion, a quiet and dignified way out. Becky had met with him not to sign anything, not to plan anything, but to ask a single question she apparently returned to across all 4 meetings, in different formulations, circling the same wound. Was it her? Was there something about her specifically that made closeness impossible for him? She had been sitting across from a lawyer her mother-in-law had retained, in hotel lobbies and quiet cafes, trying to understand if she was the reason her own marriage felt like a room with no door. She was not leaving. She had never been leaving. She was trying, in the only way available to her, to find a reason to stay. Wang sat alone in his office for a long time after that. The city moved outside his window, indifferent and continuous, and for once he did not find it comforting. He did not send a message, did not ask his lieutenant to arrange a time, did not do any of the things he normally did when he needed to address a situation, because this was not a situation. It was something else entirely, and he was done pretending otherwise. He found her in the main room, reading. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not fear, never fear with Becky, but a recognition that this was not the usual variety of silence he was bringing into the room. He was not carrying his armor the same way tonight. She noticed. She always noticed things he assumed went unseen. He sat down, not across from her, closer than that, close enough that the distance he had maintained for 300 days became suddenly, plainly visible in its absence. She closed her book and waited. "I know about Park Sung-yi," he said. The name landed. He watched her take it in, watched her understand what it meant that he knew it, and watched something shift in her face, not guilt, but a tiredness so deep it looked almost like relief. The kind that comes when a thing you have been carrying alone is finally acknowledged by someone else. She did not ask how he knew. She simply looked at him and said, quietly and without flinching, "Then you know I wasn't leaving." "I know. I was trying to understand." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge beneath it, fine and sharp as wire. 300 days, Wang. Every event, every room, every night in this apartment where you were somewhere down that hall and I was here and the distance between us was so complete I started to wonder if it was me, if something about me specifically made it impossible. She paused. "I needed to know if your own mother thought so too." The words sat between them without softening. He did not deflect. He had decided, somewhere between his office and this room, that deflection was a language he was no longer willing to speak to her. "There are men," he said, "who have spent years looking for the edge of what I've built, the way to reach me past everything I've put in place." He stopped, started again because this deserved precision. "You are the only thing in my life I cannot calculate, cannot manage, cannot afford to lose, and cannot fully protect." He looked at her directly. "Every person I have ever held close has eventually become a target. That is not a theory. I have watched it happen. And I decided, before we were married, that I would not let it happen to you. That distance was the one guarantee I could actually make." The room was very still. "It was wrong," he said. "What I protected you from was nothing compared to what I did to you instead." Becky looked at him for a long moment. 300 days of questions, of windows, of red blouses worn like quiet acts of resistance, all of it present in her eyes. "Real Wang," she said finally, not loudly, not with anger exactly, but with the full, unambiguous weight of a woman who had waited long enough and knew precisely what she was asking. "Real, or let me go." The silence that followed was the most honest moment the apartment had ever held. He chose real. Not immediately, not with words, but with the one thing he had withheld for 300 days. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Both of them looked at it for a moment, his hand over hers, the simplest gesture in the world made enormous by everything it had taken to get here. Then Becky exhaled, slowly, and the last of her careful composure settled into something else. Something quieter and more honest than composure. Something that did not need to perform itself for anyone. The night that followed was tender in the way that only earned things can be. Not urgent, not dramatic, just two people finally present with each other in the same room, in the same moment, without the architecture of distance standing between them. He was not the man the city feared that night. He was simply a man, learning the geography of his wife's trust with the careful attention of someone who understood, completely, the value of what was being extended to him. She did not rush him. He did not retreat. What passed between them belonged entirely to them, and it was enough. Morning came gray and still, the city resuming itself 40 floors below as it always did, indifferent to what had changed in the night. Wang was already awake when the light came through. He lay quietly for a moment, present in a way the apartment had never allowed before, and then he got up and made 2 calls. The first was to his lieutenant. The second was to his mother. He drove to her house alone. She received him in the sitting room with the careful stillness of a woman who had been expecting this visit, which told him she already knew what had come to light. He sat across from her and did not raise his voice, because this did not require volume. It required clarity. "She is my wife," he said. "What you arranged was not protection. It was a verdict. You decided I was incapable and acted on that decision without telling me, and she spent months sitting across from a lawyer trying to understand if she was the reason her own marriage was failing." He paused. "Dismantle it. Everything Park Sung-yi was retained to do. Today." His mother looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his face was different from what she had been expecting. He could tell. She nodded once and said she would handle it by evening. He believed her, and he left. The external threat, the rivals who had been watching his visible fracture with the patient interest of people waiting for the optimal moment, was addressed with the quiet, surgical precision his organization had always been capable of when he was fully present at the center of it. 3 days. No spectacle. The pressure points identified, the leverage neutralized, the message delivered in the language those particular people understood best. It was over before it fully began. What was different this time was that he told Becky, not the operational details but the shape of it, the nature of the threat, the response, the outcome. He sat with her at the kitchen island, where they had shared so many silent mornings, and he spoke to her as a partner. She listened, asked 2 questions, both were good ones. He answered them, and something in his chest settled into a configuration it had never quite managed before. 3 weeks later, there was another event. There was always another event. That had not changed. The city's calendar of carefully orchestrated gatherings continued its rotation without regard for what had shifted in a penthouse 40 floors above it, and Wang Xianghwa was still a man with obligations, and Becky was still his wife. Some things remained the same in their outward shape. But the inside of things had changed entirely. She wore the red blouse. She had considered something else, briefly, and then decided against it. The red blouse had been with her through all of it, through the performed smiles and the hollow elevator rides and the long, quiet nights of a marriage that existed only in photographs. It deserved to be present for this, too. He was waiting in the foyer when she came out. He looked at her the way he had been learning to look at her, fully, without the quick professional inventory and the immediate return to neutral. He let himself look. She had noticed him doing this in the weeks since everything changed, this small, deliberate act of allowing himself to see her, and every time it happened, it still caught her somewhere tender. They arrived the way they always had. The car, the entrance, the flashbulbs finding them in the dark. His hand moved to the small of her back with the same ease as always, the same gesture, the same placement, 300 days of practiced choreography. Except it was not the same, not remotely. She felt the difference immediately. The weight of his hand was present in a way it had never been before, not positioned, not managed, but resting. Certain. The hand of a man who was not performing ownership but expressing something he had finally stopped being afraid to name. She did not look up at him. She did not need to. She simply walked beside him into the room and let the moment be what it was. They moved through the evening together differently than they ever had. Not dramatically. There was no grand display, no sudden transformation that the room's observers could have pointed to and defined. It was subtler than that. The inch less of distance between them. The way he angled toward her when someone addressed them both. The brief moment midway through the evening when she said something quietly, and he laughed, genuinely, unguardedly, just a man laughing at something his wife said and then caught himself, and did not pull the expression back. Later, the penthouse, the city below arranging itself in its familiar grids of light. Becky stood at the window that had witnessed so many solitary nights, the red blouse catching the glow from outside, and Wang came to stand beside her. Not near her, beside her. The distinction was everything. They stood quietly for a moment, looking at the city together. Then he reached down and took her hand. Not for cameras, not for the careful architecture of a public image, not for any reason that existed outside this room and this moment and the two of them finally, fully present in it. Simply because she was there, and he was at last here. He had protected her from every enemy imaginable, except the one inside his own walls, his silence, and she had stayed anyway. That was the moment he understood. She was never the liability. She was the only thing worth protecting everything else for. Where are you watching from? Drop your country below and tell me, would you have stayed? And if this story moved you, subscribe. There is so much more where this came from.